Everyone. My name is Daniel Millward. I am a second year OIP master's student, presenting today on an article titled Noise Exposure During Pre-Hospital Emergency Physicians Work on Mobile Emergency Care Units and Helicopter Emergency Medical Services. Down is next, right, Bubba? Okay. All right. Okay, so let me just as kind of an introduction. Um, Previous studies have shown that those who work in pre-hospital settings, so paramedics, helicopters, and mobile emergency care units. So this includes paramedics, EMTs, physicians, and nurses. They are exposed to pretty high noise levels due to the vehicle and environment that they are working in. So you think about obviously in helicopters, sitting inside the engine and the rotor of the helicopter is going to be significantly loud. Inside of an ambulance, whether that is in the treatment compartment or just in the driver's seat, you have sirens going on, which adds a significant level of noise. And then ambient noise as well from just driving down the roadway. So prior studies have shown in HEMS or HEMS that there is a risk of work-related hearing loss just due to the nature of the job and due to the vehicle that they operate with. There was a study showing that noise exposure in alpine helicopter rescue operations exceed national levels. A lot of the times in HEMS, patients are hot loaded, which means that they land the helicopter, they package the patient, and they load them onto the helicopter while the engine is still running for a faster departure to get them to the hospital quicker. So obviously, noise exposure outside of the aircraft would significantly increase because the engine is still running. And past studies have also shown that EMTs and paramedics working in ambulances seem to be exposed to pretty high levels of noise. Obviously, this is en route to the emergency location with sirens on, or en route to the hospital following their time at the site of the emergency. So, the study for ambulances showed that there was a mean of 96 decibels of exposure when the sirens were on, which obviously is higher than the occupational exposure limit and requires further investigation and use of hearing protection and other controls. There were two studies also shown or that show that EMTs experience hearing loss, especially in the high frequencies, which makes sense. Obviously, an ambulance siren is at a pretty high frequency. So, and high frequencies are also those most typically involved in occupational hearing loss. That's kind of what goes first. So this study took place in Denmark between March 2016 to August 2016. And so the mobile emergency care unit, or MECU, consists of an anesthesiologist, so a physician, and an EMT. This isn't a traditional ambulance, it's just a vehicle. They are able to supplement the traditional ambulance that have paramedics or EMTs. In this study, the MECU consisted or responded to anywhere between 10 to 15 emergency responses per day on average. There are 28 physicians from 3 different MECUs throughout the country and 3 different cities that enrolled in the study. As they were conducting the study, they separated noise exposure measurements by urban, rural, or motorway responses, both en route to the scene of the emergency or back to the hospital to the emergency department. For HEMS, there were about 3 missions per day on average during the course of this study. It was in the same time frame, so August to, or what was it? March 2016 to August 2016. According to the operator manual for the Airbus EC-135 helicopter, The noise inside of the cabin generated by the engine ranges between 84 to 96 decibels, depending on what they're doing, whether they're taking off, flying, or landing. Um, in Denmark, and I'm assuming with most other countries, in this occupation, the use of a helmet with earmuffs is mandatory, but some of the physicians and pilots in this study chose to use earplugs under their earmuffs. So to control for hearing loss associated with working in a MECU or HEMS, they also had a control group of daily in-hospital activities, so those working inside the actual hospital. For MECU and HEMS shifts, they obtained sound pressure level averages over 8-hour MECU shifts and 12-hour HEMS shifts by putting two miniature microphones connected to a power supply and a digital recorder. The MECU physicians wore the microphone lateral to the auditory canal with two custom-made holders to get the best possible, I guess, the most similar personal noise exposure. And HEMS physicians and pilots who enrolled in this study wore the microphones within their earmuffs. And obviously, all the recorded files were analyzed to calculate equivalent sound pressure and the peak pressure level. So this was the slide that I had AI help me with because I couldn't really understand distortion product autoacoustic emissions super well. So DPOAEs are sounds generated by the inner ear in response to two different tones. They're produced by the outer hair cells of the cochlea. DPOAEs are used to indicate healthy cochlear function and to detect hearing loss. So obviously in this study, it'd be important because we're testing for hearing loss. In clinical use, they're used to do newborn hearing screenings and routine hearing evaluations and to monitor hearing in at-risk individuals. So MECU physicians and HEMS pilots and physicians. What they did for the study is they tested DPOAE amplitudes at baseline. And following exposure to noise, so during flight missions or MECU missions, they conducted those tests again at 2, 3, and 4 kilohertz. And the measurements focused on level shifts between baseline and post-exposure values. They were also using pure tone audiometry to detect any hearing loss compared to the in-hospital control group. And they also controlled for participant sex, age, and noise-related hobbies, so like hunting or any other hobby that might result in a lot of noise. So the study used linear mixed effects regression models to analyze the effects of noise exposure on sound pressure levels. For SPL exposure types, measurement side and ear protection were fixed effects. Individuals were random. DPOAE data was grouped into the 4 exposure categories. PTA was used as an outcome variable to assess hearing thresholds at specific frequencies, accounting for age, sex, and exposure groups. So a total of 444 measurements, so one for each ear, were obtained with the 3 MECUs. So each MECU physician measured between 1 to 34 times total. Each HEMS pilot or physician measured between 5 to 44 times total, resulting in 414 exposure measurements. There was a significant level shift of the DPOAE emissions at 4 kilohertz for HEMS crew compared to MECU physicians. And they found that for HEMS physicians and pilots, noise affected the outer hair cell function of the inner ear, which could potentially reduce their hearing ability over time. So table 1 lists the average A-weighted noise levels throughout the entire measurement period with all the different types of exposures. So combining the decibel level or the average decibel level over the noise exposure measurements, it was found that for MECUs, urban roads were 72 decibels, rural roads were 75, and motorways were 77. So That makes sense. As the vehicle's going faster, noise exposure levels slightly increase. Um, HEMS physicians and HEMS pilots were slightly higher at a 8-hour average of 82 and 83 decibels, respectively. Maximum levels that were measured in C-weighted decibels were obviously pretty significantly high. So the highest recorded levels for HEMS was obviously higher than those of the MECU at 118 decibels for both the physicians and the pilots, which is obviously concerning. We know that noise exposure above 90 decibels can be harmful to the ear, especially over 8 hours. Luckily, over 8 hours, or I guess 12 hours for HEMS, it didn't quite reach that level, but in the EU, they actually have a limit of 80 decibels before hearing protection is required. So this figure shows the coefficients for noise exposure with the in-hospital group as reference, which is kind of hard to see because the text is really small, but this is the in-hospital group. The average decibel level was 70, and then we can see that it just increases with MECU, ambulances, and HEMS. Interestingly, the HEMS physicians and pilots who used earplugs they had a higher coefficient for noise exposure than HEMS pilots and physicians who only used the earmuffs. Table 2 shows the average exposure time per emergency response during different types of exposure. So on average, MECU physicians were exposed to siren noise for 42 minutes per day. HEMS personnel were exposed to helicopter noise for between 41 to 44 minutes during each working shift. So, oh, hang on. Okay, that's not going to work. Never mind. Table 3 lists the average distortion product autoacoustic emissions amplitude during different types of exposure. So ambulance exposure, HEMS exposure, or in-hospital exposure. The DPOAE amplitudes at 4 kilohertz for HEMS crew compared to the MECU measurements were significantly lower, with a p-value of 0.03, indicating that there is an impact on sensory outer hair cell function and hearing in general after flight missions. And none of the other measurements were statistically significantly different compared to the reference MECU exposure. So, as was mentioned before, the authors of the study found out that following flight missions, there was obviously some type of impact on the outer hair cell function of the ear, which is concerning. Although they only do an average of about 3 missions per day, if we think about other air ambulance services who do more than this or who may work in helicopters that are louder, this is definitely of concern, and it would be worthwhile to study those populations. Pure tone audiometry and pure tone audiometry did not differ between the groups when the effects of age and sex were accounted for in the analysis, but they were significant factors as expected, since younger subjects had lower hearing thresholds compared to older subjects, and female subjects had lower hearing thresholds compared to the male subjects. So the general findings of this study show that the overall pre-hospital noise exposure for MECU and HEMS response in this population in Denmark exceed the EU threshold for 80 decibels. Obviously, greater noise was measured in HEMS, which is kind of to be expected considering the vehicle that they're using. And If we do correct for an entire workday, obviously they're not running in the ambulance for 8 hours with the siren on at all times. They're not riding in the helicopter for 8 hours. On average, the exposure level was lower than the threshold for the daily limit. Um, and obviously, they found that there was an effect on sensory outer hair cell function for HEMS personnel at 4 kilohertz. So some of the strengths that I found in this study, and what the authors mentioned, were that they used personal noise recording microphones, which are very comparable to dosimeters, which are able to collect noise exposure data over a period of time. Obviously, the placement of these microphones was very helpful in getting as accurate of a representation of noise exposure as possible. Even in HEMS, despite them wearing helmets and earmuffs, they were still able to place the microphone in them to get a pretty accurate exposure assessment. Another strength is the study seems to be one of the first, or at least one of the few, that focus on noise exposure in pre-hospital settings, especially in HEMS. I did find other studies discussing noise exposure in ground ambulances, but not so much in air ambulances. So it's definitely a step in the right direction as far as continuing to monitor this specific population, which, they're essential workers. They're out there saving lives, and uh, protecting them from occupational exposures is definitely important. Um, for as far as limitations go, the DPOAE and noise exposure recordings were only performed on physicians. So we don't have data from the pilots of HEMS, nor do we have them from the EMTs, either from HEMS or in the ground ambulances. Ambulance recordings were only done when the patient was being escorted by the physician, and only performed on the physician. So we don't know anything about the driver. We don't know what their exposure is like sitting in the driver's seat versus the treatment compartment. And obviously, this study can't be generalized to all ambulances in the world, nor all air ambulances, because every city, every country uses different makes and models of ambulances, different aircraft. So it's hard to generalize the results of this and assume that they'll be the same throughout the world. There was also a possibility of noise conduction through the body due to vibrations from the helicopter engine. So we don't know if any of that noise that was measured was actually due to vibration. Um, and as with pretty much every study, there's a risk of recruitment bias. So it's possible that someone with hearing loss would have rejected to enroll in this study, um, just uh, due to not wanting to have hearing loss pointed out and possibly risk losing their job. So in general, um, it was found that pre-hospital noise exposure during MECU and HEMS response exceeds 80 decibels. The authors recommend possibly looking into better soundproofing insulation for both MECUs and ambulances, possibly HEMS as well. But obviously, there's not much you can do on a helicopter to soundproof it. They recommend providing earmuffs or plugs to MECU and ambulance workers. As far as I could tell, none of them in the study wore earmuffs or earplugs, um, despite noise levels obviously being pretty high and peaking at around 110, 115 decibels. Offer more protective gear to HEMS personnel, even though they already use earmuffs. And using true tone audiometry, the authors of the study did not find any evidence of occupational hearing loss, but obviously found an effect on the outer hair cells of the HEMS physicians. So I had a couple of questions for discussion. So other than what the authors recommended of possibly insulating or soundproofing the ambulances or the MECUs, which are just cars essentially, um, what other controls might be useful in protecting against high noise exposure? So whether that's administrative, engineering, elimination, is there anything that you guys can think of that might reduce noise exposure to these workers?
Is once you in the air ambulance or whatever, and you're transporting the patient, and you put that ear pro on, talking with the patient is going to be difficult. So then you're just going to remove the ear pro, right? The solution is going to have to, consider that how you're going to communicate with your patient.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that they talked about too, is it's important to obviously prevent occupational hearing loss as much as possible without compromising communication between the crew members and patient.
Or making the patient worse too, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Now they have hearing loss.
Yeah.
I was gonna say maybe the patient needs them also.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure. Obviously, I've never been life flighted before, but I'm not sure if I don't know if anyone here has ever been inside of a medical helicopter or know someone who has, if they wore earplugs or earmuffs. I'm not sure if that's provided or if they just kind of
100% provided.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So then that would make communication even more difficult unless there's radio communication between the earmuffs.
I wondered, I was thinking about the backup signal for vehicles. Some of them have been changed to kind of a white noise that's less, a lower volume than the siren or the beep.
Yeah.
And I just don't know if emergency vehicles need the full blasting siren or something less intense that maybe it does, the white noise doesn't travel as far, but maybe we're assuming we need to take loud.
Yeah. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if we could find out how people behave around ambulances when there's a siren versus when there's just the lights. I also wonder if we could lower the frequency too, because it mentions in here that occupational hearing loss starts at higher frequencies. So it'd be interesting to see if a lower frequency siren was used, if that would change anything.
We've got some comments from some folks online. One person says, better insulate the vehicle. Another comment is, can some sort of ear protection with a microphone and channels between headsets be an option? And also, there are noise isolating earmuffs that still allow you to talk to people, although it might be hard putting on patients, as has been brought up.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Actually, what Talia said at my internship during a factory tour, we actually did use noise isolating muffs with communication, with radio communication. So I wonder if that would be an option. I'm sure that they use something like that though in most air ambulances. I feel like, do we have another? Yes.
I was just gonna say about insulating the vehicles again. I don't know if you could like stick soundproofing foam in them or just something to kind of better keep the noise out.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I don't know, possibly. I'm not an engineer. I don't know how difficult it would be to soundproof a helicopter or an ambulance, but
I talked about this once with a trucking manufacturer, and weight is an issue right away. But they definitely, in the trucking industry, were talking about improved sound insulation to improve the truck driver's sleep environment.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, weight, I'm guessing with helicopters and with trucks, any little ounce of weight you add increases or reduces fuel efficiency.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it would. Actually, if everything goes well with IRB, I'm doing my thesis with Intermountain Life Flight, and I'm just using a very small, lightweight air monitor. But when I first brought that up, they were talking about, oh, we're going to have to weigh it because every every ounce, every pound makes a difference for fuel efficiency and for the safety of the crew as well. So, okay, we probably have time for one more question.
Got about 5 minutes,
Okay,
probably a few of them.
okay.
Can't get off that easy.
I'm looking at that clock, which is it's close. Yeah, I just want to hear you guys' thoughts. What else can be done? What other research can be done or interventions we can do to find out more regarding this?
Well, the thing that comes to mind to me is the human element of compliance. You know, sure, you give them here, things to wear, earplugs or whatever. Do they choose to wear them? Right? Or do they not? Right? And yeah, there can be those who will choose to not to then. So that's why there's the compliance aspect of it. And so the degree to that we can take out I don't want to say take out the human element, but if we can make the environment itself no longer have the noise, that's going to be a stronger intervention than anything we ask a human to do.
Yeah, that's true. Yep, following the hierarchy of controls.
Joe, just, in follow-up to that, in solutions class, about 10 years ago, we did a study of the fire service, UFA,
Yeah.
because they had a cohort of workers that were above 50 that had significantly reduced hearing compared to the cohort just 10 years younger than them. And part of that, as we did our investigation, was that the equipment changed a lot. Compliance was a huge issue and just kind of use of PPE. But what we found was the engineers had significantly worse loss than anybody else, the drivers of the thing. And that was in large part because they had the muffs on when they used them, but they would always take one off so that they could hear like the status of what was going on at the fire service. And so they had oftentimes what you would expect to see from a shooter, a long rifle, kind of a one-sided hearing loss.
One-sided
These
hearing
guys,
loss,
so
yeah.
they'd have this loss, but it was really analogous kind of a thing. I mean, there's, outside of the engine to get all those pumps running, it's really loud. And there's not much you can do to engineer out noise reduction on that. Maybe there is in the machinery, I don't know, but it was a compliance issue. It really was the main thing.
Yep.
It was a cool solution project because we found mothballed equipment that they had used in that era of time that was really not at all engineered well for sound control.
Yep.
Anyone else have any ideas for further research on this?
What do we know about this population of the 28 anesthesiologists and the MECUs versus and the 8 anesthesiologists and the helicopters? I didn't see anything about the demographics, I guess. Did I miss that?
No, I don't think you did. I mean, yeah, and where it describes setting and study population, it says, 28 physicians from the 3 MECUs were enrolled in the study. For HEMS, a total of 6 physicians and 6 pilots from the HEMS were enrolled in the study. And in the tables, it just says, or it describes active service years, but nothing about age.
It'd be interesting to see their trends over time of what kind of hearing changes they might have had.
Yeah.
If they had long tenure in these roles or if they were just short parts of their stints of their careers.
Yeah, that's true. Or if they're full-time versus part-time, they could only pick up a couple of shifts per week, or if they do it every day. Yeah.
You'd want your anesthesiologist to be able to hear really well.
Yeah, I agree. Okay.
Another area of research that gets ignored is there's prior years, but there's very strong evidence of hearing loss from cardiovascular disease risk factors. In prospective cohort after prospective cohort, health world is pretty much oblivious to this fact, other than people who deal with hearing. And in other words, primary care has no knowledge of this, and occupational health and safety typically has no knowledge of this. And so whenever you have risk factors, they usually multiply. And so, if you want to look for areas of prevention, that's an area where you'd easily make some significant headway. Talking about ultimately the reduction as well in loss that's age related, occupational noise related.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, I wonder if obviously the study was just done for a couple months almost 10 years ago. It'd be interesting to get a population like this and follow them over time and see just what changes in different age groups and with different tenure. And yeah, just to, I don't know, I think that would be useful and interesting to see what happens over time. So.
All right, anything else? Great.
Yeah.
Turn it on, we got it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Taylor Cisneros. I'm a second year industrial hygiene student. And I'm going to be presenting on an assessment of methylene chloride related fatalities in the US from 1980 to 2018. Okay, so just some history on methylene chloride. So it's a halogenated organic solvent, and it's mostly used in paint strippers, cleaners, adhesives, sealants, and degreasers. So in the 1800s, it was used as an anesthetic for anesthetic purposes due to its narcotic effects, but that was later discontinued as there's a narrow margin between its narcosis effects and death. So they quickly stopped using that. And then in 1936, there's reports of occupational methylene chloride poisoning from paint strippers. So that's when we kind of started to see these reports come about. And then in 1952, there was a fatality reported involving a factory worker using methylene chloride as an extraction solvent. And then in 1976, a patient was hospitalized twice from using a methylene chloride-based paint stripper. And then that same patient was hospitalized a third time and later passed. But they did not know from the first two times that it was methylene chloride that sent them to the hospital in the first place. So it was previous poisonings, and then it led to their death later on. So methylene chloride, so some health effects of it, just some background knowledge again. So some acute effects are narcosis, lightheadedness, nausea, headaches, skin burns, corneal damage, arrhythmias, respiratory depression, and death. And then chronic is cancer, liver, kidney, and reproductive toxic effects, and cognitive impairment. And then some interesting things about methylene chloride is its metabolism effects is that there's hepatic metabolism, is it generates into substantial quantities of carbon monoxide, so it creates carboxyhemoglobins. So it deprivates your hemoglobin of oxygen in your body. And then it also forms formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen in your body. So OSHA has some history with its permissible exposure limits with methylene chloride. So in 1971, it first issued its PEL of methylene chloride, and its purposes was to protect workers from its acute effects for narcotics and irritant effects. And that PEL was 500 parts per million. And then in 1997, they revised that and lowered it to 25 parts per million. And then in 2010, they reviewed the 1997 standard and found that it was justified and that it's okay to keep going. And the 1997 standard also includes that there needs to be engineering and workplace controls, air monitoring, medical surveillance, and worker training. And that if your workplace does exceed the 25 parts per million, then you have to have supplied air for your workers. And then Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CPSC, also initiated labeling for methylene chloride products that cover acute effects, but not carcinogenicity. Sorry, I struggle with that word. But yeah, so that's just some background on the PEL effects. PEL history. So for this study, their methods, they looked at methylene chloride related fatalities for the period of January 1st, 1980 to December 31st of 2018. So let's say, what is that? 38-year gap. And then they used 10 different sources ranging from PubMed to poison control centers to NIOSH one, so government and non-government sources. And then they also looked at consumer deaths and occupational deaths. And so for the results, they started off with non-fatal cases, and they had 37,201 cases. And of those cases, 6,589 were occupational for non-fatal cases. And we can see that they kind of started plateauing around 2010 for total consumer and occupational around 400. And occupational is, I don't know, maybe a little less than 100 around 2010. So it really started dipping off, which is good. So it started off probably around 1700 in the 90s. And then moving on to fatal cases. So for occupational fatalities, we can see most were male for both occupational and consumer. And for race and ethnicity, most were white for occupational and consumer again. And then age, the median for occupational was 31 years of age, and for consumer, it was 45 years of age. And then year of fatality, for occupational, it was the highest year of fatalities was the 80s, and then the second highest was the 2010s. And for consumers, it was actually the 2010s. And then for products used, the number one product is paint strippers. And then the setting of the incident is bathrooms for both consumers and occupationals. And then respiratory use, most of them were not using respirators. And for those that did have respirators, they were not NIOSH approved. So continuing on with results, for fatal cases, there wasn't really a trend for overall total fatalities. But we can see that there is a dip for both consumers and occupational from 1994 to 1998. And the authors couldn't really explain this as to why there was this dip in no fatalities for those 4 years, which is interesting. But between this study, there was anywhere from 0 to 9 cases at a time per year. And then for occupational fatalities with use of paint remover and other products. So paint remover was the number one product used that caused fatalities, and it dipped in the 90s, but then it went back up and kind of skyrocketed, and is on this, based on this trend, it looks like it's still increasing when this study ended in 2018. And then all other products, it kind of decreased, but kind of looks like it was increasing a little at the end. Oh, there we go. And then for occupational fatalities in bathrooms and other settings. So all other settings, it started out about 30 and then it really just dropped. And then for bathrooms, it really started picking up in the 90s. It said that before the 2000s, bathroom-related deaths had anything from 0 to 5 cases, and then after the 2000s, it is actually 3 to 6 per year fatalities. And then some interesting points from the discussion that I found was, despite the CPSC, so that's the Consumer Product Safety group, so despite their labeling requirements in 1987 and the OSHA standards in 1997, there is still ongoing occupational and consumer fatalities. So they tried to implement these controls, but they didn't really see the results that they needed to try and prevent these fatalities. And then going off of the CPSC labeling, studies actually showed that labeling is less effective and it is not a good enough safety measure. And then there are inadequacies with respirators as commonly available vapor cartridges respirators. They don't provide the protection needed from methylene chloride, as methylene chloride actually has a pretty fast saturation rate. So if you just put on like a half base with your cartridges, methylene chloride is gonna go through that pretty fast. So you actually need supplied air if you're dealing with methylene chloride. Any other type of respirator, it's not really gonna protect you. And they found that some employers are actually just putting used respiratory protection on their plans when it came to methylene chloride. So workers were just using their half faces with cartridges. So wasn't really helping anyone on that case. And then in 2010, when OSHA was reviewing the 1997 standard, they found several common violations among different industries with methylene chloride. And those common violations were failure to provide exposure monitoring for methylene chloride in the workplace, worker training on hazards and safe work practices when dealing with methylene chloride, and appropriate PPE. So that's going back to the respiratory protection. And then there are actually safer alternatives to methylene chloride, and that includes benzyl alcohol, soy-based, and bibasic ester strippers. I don't know much about those, so don't ask me on those. But there are safer alternatives out there that can be used in place of methylene chloride. So that's where substitution can come into place. And then, so EPA is actually involved with methylene chloride as well, as OSHA does not have the authority to prohibit the use of methylene chloride and other substances and chemicals. But the EPA actually does have the authority to prohibit the use of chemicals under the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. So they have decided to step in and try and prevent all these fatalities from happening. So in 2017, the EPA actually proposed a rule to prohibit products in consumer and most commercial and industry uses that use methylene chloride. So like your paint stripper can no longer use methylene chloride that we can just buy at the store and whatnot. And then in 2019, the EPA finalized a rule prohibiting consumer sale of methylene chloride paint strippers, but it didn't address consumer and industrial uses. So we can no longer use it, but industry still could. And then this was not in the study, as the study was published in 2001. But I just thought I'd give an update to show that this is still relevant. So in April of 2024, so this year, the EPA actually finalized a risk management rule that prohibits manufacturing, processing, and distribution of methylene chloride for all consumer uses and most industrial and consumer uses. So for anyone that's in industry, I'm sure you all had to sit in on a fun little EPA meeting this summer, like I did, where we went over the rules and whatnot about how industries are now impacted by this. And many industries are having to phase out methylene chloride uses. Some have a date, like in the next year, you have to stop using it. The next 5 years, you have to stop using it. So there's little caveats. Some industries can still use it, like government industries and whatnot. But yeah, so the EPA is really cracking down on methylene chloride. So then conclusions from this study. So EPA's 2020 evaluation of methylene chloride found that all consumer uses and most commercial uses exceed health benchmarks of concern for acute, chronic, and cancer risk. And TSCA requires EPA to act to effectively mitigate these risks. So that's where that 2024 rule comes into play that I just mentioned. And then occupational methylene chloride related poisonings and deaths are preventable. And so administration control approach such as labeling is not adequate. And so this is where elimination and substitution are needed. So future research, this was actually discussed in the article. So they suggested to investigate the burden and trends and morbidities with methylene chloride, so cancer risk and lifelong disability, as the study only looked at acute non-fatal cases and fatal cases. So even if you're exposed to methylene chloride, and you can still have that risk of getting cancer from it. So they proposed that looking at those types of cases. And then also to investigate the direct neurotoxic effect of methylene chloride and how it interacts with cardiac effects and underlying heart disease and how this may change work policies. So if someone has underlying heart disease, how it may affect their work schedule and dealing with methylene chloride. So some strengths of this article that I found was it looked at multiple sources of data, not just what the government put out there, but also what individual people put out there. And then it looked at various contributing factors of exposure. And then also it used an independent reviewer for data extraction and analysis in addition to their author. So that helped prevent some bias there. And then limitations that I found with this article is each source has varying degrees of internal quality control and reporting standards. So that could potentially cause some differences among their results. And then also with this type of study, there's publication bias as usual. And then occupational fatalities may be underreported because not all workers are covered by OSHA. So you could have just like a father and son business doing these types of work. They're not covered by OSHA. And so that's not going to be reported if there was a fatality related to methylene chloride. And then consumer fatalities are likely underreported as there's not a reporting requirement for that. So that could have also gone under the radar. And then fatalities could be underreported because they could be determined as cardiovascular events. As we saw in the first slide when I talked about the history of it, that patient that went in twice before, his cause was determined to be cardiovascular events when it was actually methylene chloride. So yeah, there's some underreporting that could have happened amongst this study. And then my incorporation of AI, I had it summarize this article, and I actually thought it did really good. Honestly, you could just read this and you can understand the article, in my opinion. So the overall summary is, the article examines methylene chloride-related fatalities in the US. From 1980 to 2018, methylene chloride, a solvent used in various products, continues to be associated with deaths despite existing warnings and safety standards. The study analyzed 85 fatalities, finding that a majority occurred in occupational settings, particularly related to paint strippers. The proportion of these fatalities increased after 2000, with a notable rise in cases involving paint strippers in bathrooms. The data also indicated a decrease in non-fatal cases starting in the late 1990s. These findings suggest that while regulations are in place, there's a need to focus on more safer alternatives rather than relying solely on warnings and personal protective equipment to prevent fatalities. So yeah, that just summed up my whole presentation. And I
Question you used for that. What did you ask ChatGPT to
said,
summarize the article?
summarize this. Yeah, and I used ChatGPT. That was my first time ever using ChatGPT too. So did great. So yeah, and then moving on to questions. So I just think it's interesting that there was this drop and they couldn't explain it. So I wanted maybe some opinions. Why do you think there was a drop in fatalities from 1994, 1998? If any.
My first thought was just some problem with our surveillance data gathering, that there wasn't an actual drop that we weren't detecting.
Mhm.
They were meant to start
And
with.
it's super rare.
Yeah.
Um,
That was my thoughts too. And I thought it was really interesting because that's when OSHA put out their 1997 standard and all of a sudden there's no events around it. So yeah, that was my thought. Any others on this question? Okay, so why do you think there was an increase in bathroom and bathtub related death after the year 2000? So yeah.
People have more bathrooms these days. Like every house we build
Yeah,
has at least two baths.
that's very true.
Were people replacing bathtubs before 1990 and now they're refinishing them?
That was my thoughts. Like you go into a home before 2000s and it has like a different look than after the 2000s. That makes sense. So I definitely think like remodeling was a big one too. Which is interesting because it's after 97. Yeah.
What are the symptoms of poisoning? Like when you get methylene poisoning, are you like sweating and really like raised temperature? So would you want to be like, oh, I need to go take a shower? Or
So it's more like you just kind of feel sick. So
Okay.
you can get super lightheaded, super nauseous. One of them was that narcosis, and that just means you get unconscious, basically, pass out. So yeah, you just feel sick.
Get nausea, vomiting for carbon monoxide.
Mhm.
The levels were as high as 15%. If you're not used, if you're a heavy smoker, you get there. But if you're not a heavy smoker, you will not feel well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Feel like if you get sick, like nauseous especially, my first reaction is to go to the bathroom to throw up in the toilet because I don't want my house to be stinky, you know. So
That's true. I didn't think about that.
I think a lot of it's because it's actually done in the bathrooms, a trapped environment, poor air circulation,
Mhm.
denser than air. And so it's if you're doing paint stripping in the bathtub or around the shower stall, that's where you get the high concentrations, is why you see the deaths from there.
We had methylene chloride poisoning in Oregon, bathtub being refinished, and I've heard Bob Harrison talk about it. The heavier than air feature of the fumes, they'll often find the worker slumped over in the bathtub because they're working and it's all sitting there. And it's like, what's particularly tragic about the cases are that I think most workers assume that something is like, this is just noxious, not necessarily something that could kill them.
Mhm.
So they're very rare cases, but there's something particularly like tragic about it. And I think these workers just think they're dealing with a chemical that smells really bad, but they don't know how potentially dangerous it is.
Yeah, I read a case study kind of like that too, and they shut the bathroom door because they didn't want it going into the house, but it's actually raising the levels of methylene chloride. So yeah.
Did you see anything about lawsuits? I wonder why, I mean, consumer related deaths can have a much higher toll in industry than occupational deaths. And is there anything in the background or anything like that on that?
Not that I remember, no. It mostly just focused on the occupational.
Did you see anything, because I didn't read every word, but I didn't see it about fires and that sort of thing, and the stuff is used in basements, and what happens when you use too much solvent in the basement. It levels built up enough, and then the pilot light causes a problem, and it's a serious problem.
No, I didn't mention that, but that would be interesting.
I don't know if this seems targeted on toxic fatalities, not the other types of ways to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A note on data. So I know they pull from multiple sources, but whenever you're using the government occupational injury data, something to always keep in mind is that the fatality data and the injury data or the illness data are gathered in fundamentally different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so like comparing those trend lines is a little bit fraught. Because they have investigators that are making phone calls and looking in obituaries to get the fatalities, and there's not the same level of scrutiny for the injuries and illnesses. So it's definitely one of those things to keep in mind when comparing those two sources of data.
Yeah, it actually talks about that too. And it also talks about the consumer data too. It's consumer data as well. Because there wasn't much out there and they had to get sources from the media to find those too.
They mentioned talking to poison control too, which is an interesting avenue of gathering data.
Yeah, so there's definitely some interesting ways the data was gathered in this article, but yeah. And then my last question is, why do you think people ignore warnings such as labeling? And do you think it's effective or ineffective, and why? I mean, we have this as a control, but it's not going to be effective. Why even use it then? Any thoughts on this? Go for it.
Because it's inconvenient, like especially when you're working in like a smaller space, and not that I'm speaking from experience, but sometimes it'll say on it that you need to be in a well ventilated area.
Mhm.
But if you're in a bathroom that's not well ventilated, it would be a pain to go get like a fan or something.
Yeah.
Just like a little area, you're probably just gonna be like, it'll be fine. And then you're in a dangerous situation because you don't understand.
Yeah.
Assume all the chemicals in my house have some kind of labeling on it, but I haven't read any of them.
Yeah, me either. I'm just assuming it says don't ingest and I'm good, no matter what I do with it. So yeah.
Yeah, the former Consumer Product Safety Commission acting chair, Bob Adler, says that being exposed to information is not the same as being informed. So there's we see labels, and that's a huge problem in my world. So you see them everywhere. You start ignoring them. They all look alike, and you figure if I act reasonably responsibly, I'm going to be okay. And some warnings don't go far enough. They say you could get hurt or you could get seriously injured, but don't tell you really what that looks like.
Yeah.
Pile on, I just bought a battery powered chainsaw, because I've got a couple gas powered ones and I decided to buy a battery powered one. Well, anybody who's operating a chainsaw knows the biggest risk is you're going to cut something off or decapitate yourself. But good luck finding that. You read all this garbage about basically don't lick the anode and cathode at the same time, and a blizzard of garbage that you'd have to wade through to find anything important.
Yeah, I'd like to follow on to that. How many of you in here mountain bike? A few. Okay. The bicycle industry has common warnings, a warning booklet that the industry puts out for bicycles. So you can't say the Schwinn bicycle manual is not as good as the RAL. But Cannondale goes further, and I talked to the guy who is responsible for this. They say they add their own high risk section to their bicycles. Says, do not try these stunts unless you want to spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair. They go, and I included that in my book, and I think it's wonderful. Don't do this stuff unless you're willing to take that type of risk, and they're very explicit about it.
Yeah, it's really good.
Can I just quick ask one more question? I didn't really talk about the limitations of the carbon filter respirators, I think, too. Did it talk at all in the article about the skin exposure and what type of gloves may or may not be helpful?
It didn't talk about gloves at all. It just said that it can cause skin burns.
Because I think there's a relatively high skin absorption from methylene.
It did talk about high skin absorption.
And, a lot of times, especially consumers, they'll grab whatever glove they have in their house. Maybe if it's even cotton or leather.
Yeah.
But, vinyl versus polypropylene versus, any of the other given. It's important kind of a industrial side of things to make sure you're matching the chemical with the appropriate glove type, because otherwise you can have penetration through a non-appropriate.
Yeah, when the operators work with a solution that we have that has this, they have to use a certain type of glove, and then they also have their supplied air on too. So yeah, it's very different. I see people working with it at work compared to when people could use it in paint strippers. That's why EPA is banning it. Yeah. Yeah.
There's also an aspect of not being literate enough to understand the labeling. So not everybody is health literate. So it's hard to understand all the technical jargon that comes with labeling instead of using a language that is easy to understand. So, and that happens a lot in public health, for example. So I see that happens a lot in occupational health as well.
I agree. I've done lots of SDSs and stuff, and even on some SDSs, it just says use gloves, and it doesn't even specify what type of gloves, or it says use respiratory protection. It doesn't specify what. So you have to do extra digging and stuff. So yeah, sometimes labeling isn't even great that we have.
To clarify one thing, the doc should know this. purple stars, if you know this, but is your oxygen level high or low in carbon monoxide poisoning?
Well, hi.
Are you, people who die with carbon monoxide poisoning, is their blood red or purple?
It's red.
Why?
So you actually have a higher concentration of oxygen, you just can't release it because it shifts the oxygen hemoglobin curve.
Bingo.
So the hemoglobin is on the blood cells, but you can't release it to the blood, like to the tissue. So you don't, it's, you're next, in essence, you have a lot of oxygen, but you're oxygen deprived.
Perfect.
10 points Gryffindor.
It's always good having the docs here. So
I have beautiful cherry red.
okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys.
Same time, same place next week.
Excuse me.